So a few people came in late. Let me make sure I have your attendance. So
I'm right on time, according to my clock.
Veronica is here. Lou is here. Thank you. Good. Okay, I think that's everything. All right. So, extra handouts. Here's a handout for you. Here's a handout for you. A handout for you. And there's that. We'll leave these at the back for any stragglers. Okay, so I take it everyone got my message on the internet thing that we're going to do the course evaluations on Thursday. I just think I'd rather get it out of the way, but there's just, as you can see, I went overboard and made another 12-page handout. So I want to get through all of it. I guess it's, for what it's worth, my considered opinion, this is probably the most important material we'll deal with for the whole class. So I want to give it its room to breathe. So we're going to talk about feminism tonight. Now the interesting thing about feminism, there's two interesting things to say. One is that it's true. The second is that it's normative in a way that it hasn't been in this class so far. So most of the analysis we've seen so far in the class have been of a relatively benign nature. Like in Merleau-Ponty, for example, we saw lots of talk of normativity, where that normativity was conceived of in terms of a perceptual relation that we have to our world. When you take on a feminist lens for analyzing things, especially when you're doing phenomenology, that normativity becomes much thicker. We begin to enter more directly into the realm of ethical claims. And we're going to see in our last class an attempt on the part of Emmanuel Levinas to argue that because this is so, that because our phenomenal relation to the world is always to another, and because of that always ethical in some way, that ethics has to be first philosophy. So that's what we'll look at next class. But for tonight, we're going to think about what it might mean to add to this issue of normativity in perception a feminist lens. And I'm going to continue to do what I've always done in teaching these classes, and that I'm going to attempt to teach from inside the idea. That is, I'm going to try and convince you that it's true, but I do so with a certain degree of trepidation. Here's why. It should be somewhat obvious. I am a cisgender white man. I won the genetic lottery. I am sitting on top of Privilege Mountain. I've been paid to be here. You are paying to be here. This makes me ill-equipped in some fundamental way to be able to talk to you about the phenomenology of female embodiment. And yet I find it my task to do so. So in order to do that with some grace, hopefully, and sensitivity, what I'm going to do is simply ask for your help. I'm going to lay out the terrain. I'm going to explain the categories. I'm going to do my best to motivate the view. But I look to the women in the class to give me feedback, to keep me in check, to make sure that I am not getting on top of an intellectual high horse. And that's really important because the subtlety of the analysis contained in these texts is not to be underestimated, and the continued pervasiveness of the problems that these texts are attempting to address is to be respected. And as your teacher, my attempt to respect those things will be to defer as much as I can. So all I can do, I can't enforce this. I'm simply actively inviting all the women in the room to offer whatever feedback, perspective, and insight that they feel comfortable doing. Just to keep us all honest. Okay? Because as much as this is a philosophical exercise, as much as it is an intellectual practice, this kind of material bears on the lived experience of many, many people, and not just the topic-neutral lived experience, oppressive lived experience. And that matters. That's ethically charged territory, and I intend to do that justice by showing you just how devastating feminist critiques can be. In particular, Iris Marion Young, who I, like, without any apology, have the utmost enthusiasm for. Okay, so that's sort of my preamble. Are there any questions or concerns about that before we just jump right into the material? Okay, so we're going to start with Hannah Arendt. I'm going to jump through the biographical details pretty quickly. I just want to flag that Hannah Arendt was an intellectual giant, and she wrote a very important book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, in which she was present during denazification proceedings, and at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was, by many accounts, perhaps single-handedly most responsible for the largest number of deaths of Jews during the Holocaust. And the reason for that is that he played an instrumental bureaucratic role in orchestrating the train system. And so, from that text, Arendt coins a very important term. Many of you might have heard of it. It is the subtitle of the text, The Banality of Evil, which is this idea that we touched on in the past in this class, that evil, radical evil, is not in fact some ethereal boogeyman. Contemporary media representations of the Nazis are a really good example of how we do this. We other evil, we turn it into some spectral demon, some radicalized other. Part of what Arendt argues in her text is that this is false, that evil, radical evil, the terrible evil that makes things like genocide possible is banal in some very straightforward way, that most people like Eichmann are not evil demons from another dimension sent to destroy the planet Earth. They're regular people who are put in extraordinary circumstances and do terrible things. And so her argument is that we should not be surprised that the will to totalitarianism is alive and well in the 20th century. It is part of what makes us human. So that's Arendt, at least in that text. So, in the text that we looked at, Arendt is carrying on with a certain kind of analysis that we've seen in both Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, namely an attempt to think about everyday life. And for her, that analysis comes from a distinction that I put on your handout between what we might call the vita contemplativa and the vita activa. So, contemplation as a philosophical act of reflection on one's life versus the active living of one's life. And Arendt wants to give a philosophical account of what it is to live an active life. And this is where the feminist critique takes its first step, because if you remember from Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, their account of everyday living is one of fluid comportment, where the body is just plugged into the world. Merleau-Ponty's term is geared in. And everything just kind of flows, and our sensory motor capacities help us disclose a world and constitute a world of meaning. And Arendt says, well, look, we actually have to work really hard. If you look at everyday life, it's not like we're all just dancing through the pastures, enjoying all the meaningful splendor of nature. Life is hard. And it's something that we're all engaged in together, but there's a certain stress that comes with it. And this is what Arendt calls labor. And so, quoting from your handout, labor has an unequivocal connotation of bodily experiences, so far nothing new here, of toil and trouble, and in most cases, They are significantly also used for pangs of birth. So the idea of labor here is something that we do as a kind of basic biological process of self-sustaining. I gotta find food so I don't die. I have to do it every single day. And luckily for us, we live in a world where that process has become much less strenuous. And yet, always we have to be thinking about it. Always something that's on our mind. So the idea here is that by laboring, people produce the vital necessities that must be fed into the life process of the human body. That kind of self-regulation, self-maintenance, is quite conspicuously absent in the phenomenological analysis of the living body that we've seen thus far. The idea that the embodied subject has to maintain itself. It's not just about transcending oneself into a world. It's about maintaining oneself in the face of the world. And that's a kind of different angle on it than we've seen thus far. And so, on this view, labor as the work of living is deeply tied up with a kind of toil. And that comes with the labor of giving birth, living, and dying. Contrast labor with work. Work is different from labor. In Arendt's words, the work of our hands is distinguished from the labor of our bodies. It fabricates the sheer, unending variety of things whose sum total constitutes the human artifice, the world we live in. They are not consumer goods, but use objects, and their proper use does not cause them to disappear. They give the world stability and solidity without which it could not be relied upon to house the unstable and mortal creature that is man. So the core idea here that Arendt is working with is this notion of homo faber, the idea of the human being, the tool-using being. This recalls Heidegger's notion of the hammer. So the idea here is that there's a strong distinction for Arendt between different sorts of objects, that both of which would count as handy in Heidegger's sense. Objects who are primarily disclosed to us in our experience in terms of their utility to us. But there's a distinction that's been made now. And that distinction is between what Arendt called a use object. And the use object is a byproduct of our work. And consumer goods, which are the things that we must labor to ingest, like food. And so the really interesting claim that's made here is that use objects, things like tools, for example, or pieces of art, that those kinds of objects, they don't disappear when we use them. When you burn the fuel, it goes away. When you eat your meal, it transforms into energy and then eventually waste. Yeah, Luke?
How would something like media fit into this? What would category?
Can you be a bit more precise about what you mean by media?
Well, you can consume media, right? Something like a show or a book or a pamphlet.
Yeah, good.
And it doesn't disappear, but you still consume it.
Yeah, so it's actually an interesting question, because one of the peculiar things about our place in 21st century technologized North America is that the distinction between labor and work looks like much closer and gray than it might, say, 100 years ago. Why? Because we have used technology to automate the things that we need to consume in order to survive, so we don't labor as much as we used to. And the things that we consume for aesthetic pleasure, for example, things like film, music, it's hard to say because they aren't steady fixtures. They arise and pass away, right? They exist in a virtual space often. You know, the internet, what is the internet? Is the internet some stable thing, or is it this, you know, because it's this dynamic, unstable thing, but it's always there. It's like at the tip of your fingers at any given minute. So there is a sense in which I think the ways in which technology has conditioned our uptake of use objects actually causes some complications in this account. But I think for Arendt, she's going to say that these kinds of fixtures in our lives, the smartphone, the laptop computer, and the things that those afford us access to, the Netflix, whatever it might be, that those still will constitute a use object in the proper sense. Why? Because what it is for something to be a use object is for it to provide stability to a human world. So it's by populating our world with certain kinds of use objects that we create a sense of objectivity, a certain sense of the world as being stable and staying the same as we move around and change inside of it. And the really interesting point to note here is that this particular conception of objectivity is different from Heidegger's conception of objective presence, that distinction that we discussed when we were reading Being in Time between Zuhandenheit and Vorhandenheit, right? The handiness and the objective presence. Objective presence for Heidegger is just about something, an object being spatiotemporally located and having a certain set of properties that we can properly attribute to it. Whereas the objectivity that Arendt is talking about here is still situated within the world of handiness. But it is the persistent stability of the use objects, the things themselves that we find to be useful, that give us a sense of there being a world that we can stay in safely. And we can already see here a certain lurking critique of what we might call materialistic consumerism, where, and we'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, whereby we see the entirety of our sense of value becomes equated with the use value of the things that we have. So, Arendt thinks that our capacity to create use objects, stable tools that we use to populate our world, and create what she calls the human artifice, comes with a certain cost, a certain intrinsic violence towards nature. And I'm quoting her now on the bottom of the second page of her handout. She says that this element of violation and violence is present in all fabrication, where fabrication here is the process of creating use objects. And humanity, as the creator of the human artifice, has always been a destroyer of nature. The experience of this violence is the most elemental experience of human strength, and by the same token, the very opposite of the painful, exhausting effort experienced in sheer labor. So we see here a very interesting and subtle analysis of why people don't care about the environment. Because according to Arendt, what's happening is that we measure our own sense of value as humans by doing this violence, by turning nature into our stuff. And because we are able to do that, Arendt alleges that this is the most elemental experience of human strength. So we test our strength against nature, and we have found, in some ways, we are quite strong. We've made quite a lot of hay out of nature. At what cost? That is that's your environmental ethics class. But it's interesting to note that For Arendt, it's very, very quick that we lose balance to that, that the scale tips. And we can say that Homo faber has transgressed the limits of its activity when, under the disguise of utilitarianism, he proposes that instrumentality rule the realm of the finished world as exclusively as it rules the activity which all things contained in it come into being. This generalization will always be the specific temptation of Homo faber, although in the final analysis it will be its own undoing. It will be left with meaninglessness in the midst of usefulness. So that last line is the key here. The criticism that we have allowed technology to run amok, and because of that we're wrecking the environment, everyone knows that's true. Why is it true is a deeper philosophical question. And here we see a proposal for what the deeper philosophical and psychological motivation is for that kind of unbalance. And it's embodied here in this distinction that we've seen between meaning and use. And so the idea here is that the meaningfulness of our life becomes reduced to the utility value of the things that are in it. And this is what has been called by a number of people, in fact, a philosopher at this university named Mark Kingwall, the transactional reduction. So the transactional reduction is really profound. And in case it's not clear what that is to you, you have all had an experience of being subjected to the transactional reduction. Here's how. You go and you tell someone that you're taking a major in philosophy, and their question to you is what?
What are you going to do with that?
What are you going to do with that? Why does that seem like a coherent question to them?
Because they're focused on instrumental value.
Because they're focused on instrumental value, that's right. But why would you take it if it doesn't have an immediate, obvious economic upshot for you? That's the transactional reduction. And it's so pervasive that the question itself just seems like an obviously reasonable question. And now you'll see when you go to your philosophy classes, you'll see professors being like, oh, don't worry, I've got a list of things that philosophy will do for you. People who take philosophy do really well in the GRE. Right? Because we're trying to justify our existence to this transactional reduction. Like, oh, we better come up with some use value calculus to justify our existence. And it's true. If you do really well in philosophy, you'll be way better placed to get into law school, for example. Philosophy students crush the LSAT better than any other discipline. That's a fact. Why? Because they teach you how to think and argue, and that's really helpful if you want to be a lawyer. So, it's not to say that we can't tell a practical story about what to do. Arendt's point is subtler than that. It's not like, well, just, no, it's not about this kind of rejection of utility. It is the conflation of meaningfulness with utility. And the tacit assumption that the only way something could have meaning or value is if it can be explained via utility. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous in ethics. It's dangerous when you're talking about the meaning of life and the nature of experience and what you should do. So that, as a practical example, it's helpful for you to think about a good answer to that question when it comes. One that tacitly insults the person asking the question. That's what I try to do. Okay, so the last piece here is action. And action is of a different sort than labor and work. Action is important because it's going to set the stage for what we're going to talk about next class as well. Because in humanity, otherness and distinctness become uniqueness, and And what humanity inserts with word and deed into the company of its own kind is uniqueness. So the idea that's being flagged here is that human beings encounter the other, and in that way we are distinct from each other, but also unique. We're all kind of like, we spend our time as phenomenologists thinking about structures of experience that we all share. But we're also all radically individual and different. Why? Because, to use phenomenological language, because we're thrown. And so all of our conditionality is subject-relative, culturally relative. Relative to your family, all the things that happened to you when you were growing up, how mean your parents were to you, whatever it was. And so, Arendt thinks that we insert into the world word and deed. So we speak to each other. And this insertion is not forced upon us through necessity, like labor, and it is not prompted by wants and desires, like work. It is unconditioned. Its impulse springs from the beginning that came into the world when we were born, and to which we respond by beginning something new on our own initiative. To act in its most general sense means to take an initiative, to begin, or to set something in motion. And the paradigm act here is when we speak to each other. And so here we see a shift that was latent in being and time. If you didn't read the sections of that text that dealt with this, the sections on discourse. But here we see the phenomenological tradition shifting into a preoccupation with language. And this is something that's we're gonna dwell in it a little bit in this class, but both Levinas and Derrida in our next class are heavily embedded in this particular conception of phenomenology as being deeply tied up with language. And so, for Arendt, the idea is that we're communicative beings, and we use language to speak to each other, to call out to each other, and that this is something that we do in a spontaneous way that isn't merely dictated by the kinds of utilities that structure labor and work. And so that's why, for Arendt, it's unconditioned. So, think about this in terms of the life world, the Lebenswelt, or the worldliness of the world, to use Heidegger's jargon. Here we see this view that the meaningfulness of the world shows up for us as meaningful in the way that it does because of our living in language together. That language connects us in a way that allows the world to be disclosed to us as meaningful. Here's a quote from page 3 of your handout. It says that without speech, action loses the actor. The doer of deeds is possible only to the extent that he or she is at the same time the speaker of words, who identifies themselves as the actor and announces what they are doing, what they have done, and what they intend to do. This is actually a really strong view, if you think about it, right? So, for those of you who are familiar with discussions in contemporary philosophy of mind, this amounts to the view that what it is for the world to show up for us is partially dependent on our capacity to think and speak about it, which is a very cognitivist kind of view. And so we see in these phenomenologists an interesting, provocative conviction that language is at the heart of our subjectivity. And this, of course, raises the immediate question of what that tells us about our relationship to other animals that don't use language, and the extent to which the world is meaningful for them. And as we've seen, Merleau-Ponty takes a much more, I don't want to say simplistic, because that sounds pejorative, but Merleau-Ponty's analysis is less dependent on language for the meaningfulness of the world. The meaningfulness of the world, on his view, is mostly structured according to practical bodily habits, and how that, coupled with perception, brings forth a world of value. But now we see this more complex view where our capacity to speak to each other and to use language has this profound conditioning effect on the world's meaningfulness for us. So this is something to keep in mind when you're thinking about this moving forward, about where language comes in and the extent to which our capacity to speak and understand has an impact on how the world seems. Okay, so let's move through Arendt and get on to Beauvoir. So Arendt says that there are 3 features of actions, where actions here are paradigmatically speech acts, and they are the following. They're boundless. Why? Since we always act in a web of relationships, the consequences of each deed are boundless. Every action touches off not only on a reaction, but a chain reaction. This is a super important point because it's going to be something that both Levinas and Derrida take a lot from in the next class. So when you're reading, if you read them, if and when you read those texts, recognize the way, especially Levinas, takes up this idea to bring ethics into the center of our phenomenological discourse. The boundlessness. When we speak, we enter into a world of endless signification. The combinations of words, the tone with which we express ourselves, the individuals that we speak to, everyone a unique individual, the way that the meaning of our utterances ramify through each individual and then back to us in conversation is without limit. Boundless. I can't help it, I have to stop for a minute. Has everyone seen those U of T things, those ridiculous posters? Boundless creativity. It's just like, it's kind of where inspiration goes to die. Like when I see that, I'm just like, I don't know, man. I want them to just like, see like boundless exploitation. Just, I don't know. I don't like it. It's kind of annoying. Am I alone here? Or people see this and it's, really? I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting cynical at my old age. I'm only like 33 though, so it's like not really a justification for my crankiness. But anyways, yeah, boundless.
You are a philosopher.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so these features follow on each other, right? Because we're embedded in this web of relationships, not only are actions boundless, they're unpredictable. One deed, one gesture, one word may suffice to change every constellation. In acting, in contradistinction to working, it is indeed true that we can never really know what we are doing. This is why there's misery in the world, right? Because you just never know how someone's going to take it. You never know what you're going to say is just going to impact someone, because they had something happen once, and you said this thing, and chain reaction. You don't know. So you never really know what you're doing. So even though you have a fully clear, determinate intention, you never know what the impact of that will be. That's why they say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Because the results of your intentions spill over, always. In all kinds of unpredictable ways. And last, and most terrifyingly, irreversible. Irreversible. There is no author or maker who can undo, destroy what they have done if they do not like it, or when the consequences prove to be disastrous. Can never make it not have happened. This is why, this is like the paradigm example for me. I haven't actually lived through this experience yet because my kids are still too small. But the first time you tell your parents you hate them, I hate you, and then it's just like, oh, you're like, oh shit, I just crossed the line. You can never go back. You can never go back. You said that, and you may apologize, and you make up, and maybe they forgive you. But I'll tell you, they died a little inside. And it never got better, right? They just kind of pretended they just forgot, just pushed it away. You can never reverse it. Now, this is where I think Arendt's analysis gets really interesting, because she says, look, because actions have these properties, there are two really important means by which we craft ourselves through actions. I'll read this quote to you. She says, without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act in the world, as it were, would be confined to a single deed from which we would never recover. We would remain the victims of its consequences forever, not unlike the sorcerer's apprentice, who lacked the magic formula to break the spell. And without being bound to the fulfillment of promises, we would never be able to achieve that amount of identity and continuity which together produce the person about whom a story can be told. And each of us will be condemned to wander helplessly and without direction in the darkness of their own lonely heart, caught in its ever-changing moods, contradictions, and equivocalities. Beautiful passage. What's she doing here? She's giving you the tools to craft a self in the midst of a boundless web of signification. And the tools she's giving you are forgiveness, in order to release yourself from the past, and promises, in order to forge yourself into the future. Because when you live in a world of linguistic significance that is boundless, unpredictable, and irreversible, you will harm others. And you will be harmed. And therefore, you have needs of forgiveness, both for yourself from others. You need to be able to forgive other people for what they've done to you. Not always. Some things are unforgivable. But you also need to be forgiven. Because that's the only way you can let the past be in the past. And you need to be able to make promises so that you can give yourself a structure now that assumes there'll be some kind of a future. You know, we're all good Heideggerians now, so we know that death is always already imminent, but we're still living. And so we need our promises to help us construct a future self. That's the only way to survive in a web of endless signification. In a linguistic life world where meaning is so tangled and ambiguous and without limit, we need tools of self-construction, and that's what she's talking about here. Now, it's worth noting that insofar as our lives are dominated by this work and this toil and this project of self-construction, that the situations of men and women are very different. And therefore, what counts as labor and what counts as work and what skillful self-construction means, when to forgive, when not to forgive, what kind of promises we can make, that those capacities will themselves be conditioned by a person's situation. And that's why we see in de Beauvoir's work a heart-rending focus on women's character and situation. So, two things I want you to keep in mind when you're processing this text, because I know the readings for this class have in general been difficult. And so as you read them, and then you get the lectures and the notes, you're still processing it, and you're marinating in it, and it's kind of percolating, and you're trying to make sense of it. I want to give you two pieces of advice for dealing with the readings that we did for this class from de Beauvoir, because they were very difficult. I could tell you from my own, reading it, I was like, this is hard. It's not easy to read. Not because it's like I don't understand, because the things she's saying are destroying me emotionally a little bit. And so I imagine that some of you had a similar struggle with the text. Is that right? Was it difficult to read for some of you? Maybe I'm just weak. I don't know. I'm just curious if anyone else struggled with the text in that way. I know I did. It was not easy. Anyone? It's good to be hanging out here, huh? All right. But no, it's just you. Fine. I'm going to give you my advice anyway. Here's the advice. advice. Understand it's a historical document, and so the situation of women in 21st century North America is different from the situation of women in post-World War II Europe. Now, there are important overlaps, right? I'm not saying, well, we've moved on, it's all good now. I'm not making that claim. There are people who want to make that claim. They're wrong. But there are important differences. And so it's important when you recognize in reading the text that she's trying to give you a picture of the world that she's living in. And in doing so, she's not essentializing. Right? So when she's talking about women being lazy and servile, she's not saying that that's what they are. She's saying that is how people become when they live in certain kinds of conditions. And so she's not railing against women. She's simply trying to show you when you close down the horizon of possibilities for an individual's agency, that affects who and what they are. Because as we know from our existential analysis, you are what you do. If you spend all day, every day, not growing and flourishing, you will stagnate. And that will become what you are. This is why I'm so desperate to stay in academic work, because I've worked in an office and I'm like, no, I can't do it. Because I know what 50 hours a week in an office looks like and what it does to you. That's what she's talking about here. If your only job is to keep the kitchen clean and raise the brats, and that's the horizon of significance for you, that will have a radical conditioning effect on your subjectivity. That's the point. And so, this is from the top of page 5. Arendt says, but we must only note that the varieties of behavior reported are not dictated to women by her hormones, nor predetermined in the structure of the female brain. They are shaped, as in a mold, by her situation. This is so important. And we're going to come back to this more throughout the lecture, but I just want to flag this now, and I'm going to keep hammering on it through the lecture. This is so important because the predisposition that we all of us have to think about women as having an essential character that they either deviate from or don't is so ingrained. It's so ingrained that you see psychologists at this university trying to argue that women are by nature passive and less interested in intellectual activities. The stupidity of these kinds of claims should be hyper-salient to you as a philosophically reflective individual. Why? Because the conditions of an organism's situation, its evolutionary history, its cultural situation, are simply that, conditions. And then an individual executes their agency from within those conditions. And those conditions circumscribe a horizon for the individual, but they do not determine what the individual is by nature. It doesn't reveal some inviolable, magical, biological law. It simply tells us about a pattern. And then we have to make choices about how to interpret that pattern and what to do about it, especially if that pattern is oppressive. So again, part of what I'm trying to do here is to equip you intellectually to deal with any absurd biological essentialist claims that you might encounter in public discourse around the role of women or the existence or non-existence of non-binary gender identities. These are live conversations that are happening right now in the legal system, in public consciousness. And the analysis we see in de Beauvoir and Jung have powerful philosophical tools for keeping yourself informed and reflective about these issues. Because sometimes you're like, I don't know what to think. They're going to help you be rigorous and clear about what's going on here. Okay? So let's get back to the women's situation for a moment. De Beauvoir says that women struggle with a kind of paradox. And the paradox consists of two things. The first is that women belong to a man's world. What does that mean? It means civilization was built by men. And at the root, women were possessions for like a super long time. That's just a historical fact. And we're still dealing with the fallout of that, right? Like, of course, women have the right to vote, they can get whatever jobs they want, but the pervasiveness of the objectification of women is still very prevalent in different ways. And so, this is why de Beauvoir says that women still belong to a man's world. And yet, in belonging to that world, they are isolated from fully participating in it. Precisely because they belong to it rather than help to fully enact it as agents. And so, thus, shut up in that world, surrounded by the other, they can settle down nowhere in peace. And this lack of peaceful settlement, to use Beauvoir's term, it entails that women's agency is compromised in a number of ways. And this compromised agency then impacts the way in which the world shows itself as a horizon of possibility. And mining out in detail what that actually means, that's what Young is trying to do. It's all well and good to say, women are oppressed. How exactly? Oh, well, there's wage inequality. Okay. How does that impact the subject? And that's what's so penetrating and devastating about Young's work, is that she takes you into the body and she makes you feel, or she tries to, what it's like to live in a body that is oppressed, literally, by its enculturation. And we see a foreshadowing of that analysis right here in Beauvoir's work, where she says, the world does not seem to woman as an assemblage of implements, intermediate between her will and her goals. This is Heidegger. It is, on the contrary, something obstinately resistant, unconquerable. It is dominated by fatality and shot through with mysterious caprices. Now, part of the reason she goes that way is because her analysis of women's situation is dominated by post-war Europe, in which women are still trying to find a place for themselves outside the home. And so that is one of the major struggles. And so the fatality and the unconquerability and having nowhere to settle down in peace is this idea of just kind of being shut up inside a home and not really having the ability to fully enter the world, because you're tied down to your responsibilities in a way as a woman that is still prevalent today, but less so. That's less the focus today. Pardon me. So, what I want to do now is I want to have a bit of a discussion. I want you guys to brainstorm a little bit. You could do this in groups or you could do this individually. I don't really care. It's up to you. Maybe the best thing to do would be to have a few groups, and just make sure that there's at least 1 or 2 women in each group. And what I want you to do is think about the difference and brainstorm some of the struggles that you think represent women's struggles today, now, and how those are different from the kinds of problems that de Beauvoir is focused on in the text that we're reading. Because what is really important for me to do for you tonight is show you how the principles and conceptual architecture that's being used in these texts is still alive, even if the content that they're organizing has changed with historical conditions. And so in order to do that, we need to get some fresh content. We need to get concrete, specific examples of what's going on now, and then you'll see how those plug into the conceptual architecture that we've been developing. Does that make sense? Okay, so I put a caveat on your handout. The caveat is this. In your discussion, if you find yourself thinking, well, not all men, just don't say that. Bracket that thought. Just let it sit there, watch it for a minute, and then it will go away, and that will be good. So, if you guys can, let's say what, there's enough of us, I think, to have a good 4 groups, right? Probably? Yeah, so cluster into 4 groups. Make sure that there's some distribution of gender in the groups. And then I want you to brainstorm, list off some things that you think typify women's situation and character and struggle in 21st century North America and Canada, as opposed to 1949 in Paris. Okay, so I'll give you a good 10 minutes for that. And if you want, I'm gonna hover around. So I'll stick my head in. I want to hear what you guys have to say. Yeah, possible. Yeah, of course.
So I think you're the expert. No, you two. There are 2 experts.
I was thinking there has to be some. I mean, from my mom's experience,
There is a role that there are biological differences that play a role, right?
Well, yeah, there's physiological differences.
Physiological is also like
it's devastating, but it's all because there's always this,
different kinds of toys and stuff.
Right, okay, so
well, I mean, there's the multiculturalism aspect.
that's right. But here's the thing about preference, right? What is a preference?
It's conditioned by your environment, I understand that, but like, we're like, trying not to
trying to take care of the kids, and it's almost
say
naturally.
Like boys like G.I. Joes and girls like Barbies?
no, that's like a gender thing, but like, we're naturally aggressive.
Right. So, okay, so let me give you, this is the line on biological essentialism, right? Because there are such things as real differences. But here's the thing about human beings. We're not raccoons. Which means we have real agency, and we can self-determine, which means every real pattern that you can find in the physiological system and the behavioral dispositions that it enables, we have to make a choice about what the meaning of that will be.
There has to be something with.
Right? Remember when we talked about Heidegger and I was talking about feelings? Right? I have this feeling about a thing that I really like. You have to make a choice about what the meaning of that feeling will be for you relative to your action.
9 to 5, then
right? So it might be that, like, on average, men have a denser muscle mass. Right? That's true, but it looks like if you go and you look at the lions, for example, women do all the hunting in the females do all the hunting in the pond, right? So we don't, just because there's some species level trait distribution that averages out in a certain way, doesn't tell you anything essential about how the person should live, right? Why? Because you give me any trait that you think is fundamentally male, aggressive mix. I will find you a woman who is more aggressive. Give me any trait that you think is fundamentally feminine.
Well, what about you personally then?
I will find you a man
Your struggles
who embodies that trait to a higher degree than any woman you'll find. Right? So what that means is statistical averages
I don't know, I feel like a lot of things are
of trait distribution in any given population can tell you about patterns.
That's why for me
They tell you nothing about inviolable essences. It's just about how biological and cultural history has conditioned us in certain ways. And the point of these analyses is to say, we have reified those differences, turn them into static categories, and then use them to enforce violent interpretations on how people ought to live. Which is why you, like, how long until women were allowed to vote? How long until they weren't possessions? So they weren't, still to this day. women are given away.
You've never
when they get married.
experienced
Right?
anything.
The father walks them down the road and gives them over to the care of the man because, oh, my precious flower is all grown up and I'm going to give her away to this man who will now take care of her. That concept, that way of thinking about the value and meaning and possibility of a person's life is the result of taking real differences, real patterns in physiology and behavior, and turning them into norms which we then use to enforce cultural norms about how people ought to live. That's insanity. It's just, it's awful, right? So, understand the power of the existential analysis. There is no condition that gives you a determinate ought for how a person needs to live. Because for any trait that you might think that functions as a premise and argument for an ought claim, I will find you a person who is different, has that same trait in higher quality. You can't play that role in the influence. Therefore, you have to choose. We have to create conditions, cultural conditions that people are empowered to make those choices.
And all the back of the house, there's people who like don't speak English that well, or guys. Yeah, carrot things and grills and.
I think basically all her restrictions are still not.
I don't know, it's never really, it's hard for me to see, but
Now, what she described, pretty much it's the same.
Okay, well, what about not you personally, but like you know, specifically? I mean, right now there's people who like try to go to Planned Parenthood and they're like attacked by protesters. They can't even get
some religious
like sex services to Planned Parenthood probably because they can't get access to birth control and stuff like that. They try to do like simple.
well, I mean, things like,
yeah, for sure, for society. All these doctors have like Jesus Christ and the woman is connected to the child.
No, it could have been a man and now
yeah, the child, the man goes the body like that everywhere. Feminism
and women are expected to be the ones to,
whereas
especially in the Russian
women also have
a guy is staying with the kid when you mean the mother is working.
But then not places like Norway, Sweden, both parents get like 4 months or something.
we've taken that as very
There's schools that can, a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yes, you wind up the number one.
But yeah.
You should have been at the same level as them.
Yeah, men have the responsibility to fight, but women have an equal responsibility to take care of all the shit that was happening at home.
What about you, Mr. Smith?
I'm just flying on the wall. Yeah. What do you guys come up with?
I don't actually have really, like.
Most of it's really child-related things.
Child-related.
I like
Child-related, yeah.
So, take a look at tribalism.
Very burning. Like, I thought you were very points, right? Very much shackled to motherhood.
You
I hear
know,
that.
physiologically, they're more.
It's like,
What about sexuality?
Right? But women, like, physiologically.
And what, in marketing and
Everything.
Take care of what was happening at home.
in the workplace and the way that we formulate these kinds of responses. You could be sexist.
The woman is.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
At our roots, like, I feel like we are like discriminatory at all. It's just like, we're still
I think that here in Canada, because it's very different because here.
Yeah, they're disappearing gay people in Russia right now. Like, they're slightly different.
yeah,
They're a little bit behind the ball.
That's
for sure.
Yeah, but you also can't say
that's
this
what you're saying.
Yeah. But, I don't know, like, there if you dress like,
Yeah.
if you dress like,
Because you shorter skirts are like
Six women,
fundamental
and they talk about all
you
of
will
them.
get,
have more in depth to
you will
do
get reactions
this long stuff.
right away. Whereas people are much more reserved and people will, like, come up to you and say,
What makes that?
like, kinder things.
So it's like more direct.
They're more direct, yeah. But, well, the way that you make this.
yeah, but I think the working part was like, most of this responsibility is to society. Women doing
And that,
that.
and I mean, that, that'll
Like,
be
carrying a
despite the fact, I think that despite the fact that here is much more
Like
enclosed and like people aren't as open about their sexuality on the streets here, like it's still there and the media.
It's like
I think here people are using women even more
because like you have to
to self-image because that is kind of the
it's
exit.
like men
Like that.
statistically cancel a ball farther than women can. So it's like
But it's weird too, because like the coffee was really bad, it's like happening to women everywhere, but then
How are we doing? Just want to check in.
express that, you know, they're
Good? Need a couple more minutes?
Yeah, exactly. But
Hey!
everybody goes home and,
How are we doing?
you know.
Do you need a couple more minutes, or are we ready to like bring this back? It's up to you.
couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes, okay. Everyone listening to the women in the group? Okay, no mansplaining.